I don't really remember anything about the Beatle days. It seems like a sort of, previous incarnation.
George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, was known for his calm, spiritual nature. But behind that peaceful exterior burned a fire of resentment that shocked even his closest friends. There was one man, one figure in his life, that George simply could not stand. No matter how hard he tried to move past it, the anger only grew deeper. Who was this person? And why did Harrison and the Beatle who preached love and peace despise him more than anyone else? Today, we uncover the hidden feud that defined George Harrison's private battles, a story darker than fans ever imagined. Who was this person George Harrison despised the most? And why? Stick with me till the end, because the answer may surprise you. When you think of legendary figures in Hollywood or music, it's often easy to forget that before the lights, cameras, and fame, they were simply ordinary people. Every superstar has a beginning, and often that beginning is far from glamorous. The story here is no different. To truly understand the journey, we have to go back to the very start, the childhood, the humble upbringing, and the struggles that shaped a personality destined to become unforgettable. Born into a modest household, life didn't hand out luxuries or privileges. Instead, what existed was a small town, a hard-working family, and a child who had to make sense of the world with very little. The early years were marked by simplicity, small houses, simple meals, and evenings filled not with television or extravagant outings, but with the warmth of family conversations. These early experiences may have seemed ordinary at the time, but in hindsight, they were the foundation of a resilient spirit. The family itself wasn't wealthy. The parents worked tirelessly just to make ends meet. Bills often loomed larger than paychecks, and the idea of wealth or fame felt like a dream reserved for others. Yet, what they lacked in money, they made up for in values. They instilled discipline, responsibility, and above all, the idea that hard work was the only path to any kind of success. This mindset would later become the cornerstone of everything achieved in life. School wasn't easy either. Like many kids from modest backgrounds, there was always a sense of being different. Not having the newest clothes or the trendiest shoes set them apart from classmates who came from more privileged families. There were moments of quiet embarrassment, moments of wishing life could be easier. But those same experiences sparked a determination to rise above, to prove that circumstances don't define destiny. Interestingly, even in those early days, there were sparks of talent and ambition. Whether it was an interest in performing, storytelling, or simply entertaining, family and friends, the seeds of something extraordinary were already planted. Teachers occasionally noticed a spark, though they may not have fully realized what it could become. Some encouraged, while others doubted. But for a dreamer, even small encouragements can become fuel for bigger aspirations. Home life, though, modest, played a vital role. The family's kitchen table became more than just a place for meals. It was the heart of the home, where stories were shared and resilience was built. Conversations often revolved around how to stretch a paycheck or how to support one another when things got tough. Those discussions shaped a mindset that later proved invaluable, the ability to handle pressure, adapt, and never give up. But it wasn't all hardship. There were also moments of joy, moments of laughter during simple gatherings, music playing in the background, or nights spent imagining what life could be if dreams ever turned into reality. These moments of hope balanced the struggles, and hope is often the one thing that separates those who quit from those who persist. Adolescence brought its own set of challenges. Teenage years are hard enough for anyone, but growing up with financial instability and limited opportunities made them even harder. Yet, instead of becoming bitter, the challenges became motivation. The dream of making it one day grew. stronger, pushing against every obstacle life put in the way. Looking back now, those humble beginnings weren't a disadvantage at all. They were the training ground. They were the years that shaped resilience, creativity, and the hunger for something greater. Without those early struggles, the journey wouldn't have had the same impact. Fame earned without struggle is often shallow, but fame born from hardship carries a weight and authenticity that people connect to. What's truly inspiring is that many people in those same circumstances never escape them. The cycle of poverty, doubt, and limitation often keeps people trapped. But here was someone who refused to be defined by where they started. Instead, they used it as fuel. They looked at their small town, their humble family, and thought, I want more. I will have more. That mindset, born in childhood, was the spark that lit the fire of a lifelong journey. Today, when we see the legacy, the fame, the unforgettable moments on stage or on screen, it's important to remember that it all started in a place where none of that seemed possible. That's what makes the story relatable. Because at its core, it's not just about fame or success. It's about proving that no matter where you come from, no matter how humble your beginnings, greatness is possible if you refuse to give up. And that's why revisiting these early years matters. They remind us that the person we see in the spotlight wasn't always larger than life. They were once just a kid with dreams, doubts, and determination. And that's a story that resonates with everyone, because we've all been there in our own way. So the early life wasn't just a prelude, it was the blueprint. It shaped the resilience, the grit, and the hunger for success that would eventually carry this person into the heights of fame. Without those beginnings, the story wouldn't have the same weight, and the legacy wouldn't have the same meaning. When people talk about the Beatles, the spotlight usually falls on the music, the screaming fans, and the cultural revolution they sparked. But behind all the hits, the psychedelic albums, and the packed stadiums, there was an inner circle, an intimate world of friendships, rivalries, and subtle power struggles that shaped not only the band's future, but also the personal relationships between its members. George Harrison, often dubbed the Quiet Beatle, had his own complicated place within this circle. And while his reserved demeanor sometimes gave the impression that he simply went with the flow, the truth was that George felt tensions more deeply than many realized, and he was quietly carrying the weight of conflicts that would later bubble to the surface. Inside the Beatles' inner circle, there was a very clear hierarchy. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the dominant creative forces, shaping much of the songwriting and decision-making. George, despite being enormously talented, often felt like he was placed in a junior role, with his contributions brushed aside or minimized. Ringo Starr, meanwhile, played the role of the peacemaker, always trying to keep things light when tempers flared. George's friendship with Ringo would eventually become one of the most enduring relationships of his career, but his dynamic with John and Paul was more complicated. In the early years, George admired both Lennon and McCartney. He looked up to them as mentors, especially since he was younger and less experienced when the band first formed. But as time went on, George began to feel frustrated that his creative voice was constantly overshadowed. His songs rarely made it onto the albums, often being pushed aside in favor of John and Paul's latest ideas. George once admitted that he would bring a song to the group only to be dismissed with little interest, a feeling that chipped away at him over the years. This dynamic created subtle but undeniable tension. George wasn't the type to explode or fight openly in rehearsals, but he internalized a lot of frustration. When he did speak up, it was often sharp and cutting. For example, during the recording of Let It Be, a now famous exchange shows George snapping at Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all, whatever it is that will please you." That moment revealed just how deeply George felt sidelined and undervalued in the inner workings of the band. Friendship, however, wasn't absent from this circle. Despite the conflicts, the Beatles genuinely shared love and camaraderie. George was especially close to Ringo, who respected his quieter personality and never tried to dominate him. With John, George shared moments of spiritual curiosity. They both explored Eastern philosophy, meditation, and were among the first Western rock stars to travel to India in search of deeper meaning. This bond made George feel more connected to John than Paul at certain points, although their relationship also had periods of strain. Paul, on the other hand, was both George's inspiration and his source of irritation. Paul's perfectionist tendencies clashed with George's desire for creative freedom. Paul often took control during recording sessions, telling others exactly how he thought parts should be played. While his intentions were rooted in wanting the best possible outcome to George, it often felt condescending. Over time, that dynamic hardened into resentment, leaving George with the sense that his artistry was never fully appreciated by the people closest to him. Beyond the four Beatles, the inner circle also included key figures like Brian Epstein, their manager, and later, Yoko Ono and other partners who influenced the band's decisions. George had mixed feelings about these additions. Epstein had believed in him early on, giving him a platform to grow as an artist. But later, as partners began joining studio sessions, George grew, increasingly frustrated with what he saw as unnecessary distractions. For him, music was a sacred space, and the inner circle felt increasingly cluttered. What's fascinating is that George's spiritual journey became both a source of connection and division within the group. While John initially shared his enthusiasm for meditation and Eastern philosophy, Paul seemed more skeptical. George felt passionately about incorporating sitars, Indian musicians, and spiritual messages into their music, which sometimes clashed with the band's mainstream rock sound. Yet, ironically, some of these very contributions, like his sitar playing on Norwegian wood or his masterpiece Within You Without You, would become iconic moments in Beatles history. The friendships George formed within and outside the Beatles shaped how he managed this turbulence. He leaned heavily on relationships with people who respected his individuality, such as Eric Clapton, who would later become both a close collaborator and a source of further personal drama. With Clapton, George felt creatively equal, something he rarely experienced within his own band. By the time the Beatles began unraveling in the late 1960s, George's frustrations with the inner circle had reached their peak. He famously walked out of the band during the Let It Be sessions, temporarily quitting after one argument too many. Though he eventually returned, the incident showed just how suffocated he felt by the dynamics of the group. Looking back, George's position within the Beatles' inner circle was bittersweet. He gained lifelong friendships, unforgettable creative experiences, and the chance to shape music history. Yet he also endured years of being underestimated, silenced, and sidelined. The tension between love and resentment would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping not just his relationship with John and Paul, but also fueling his drive to prove himself as a solo artist once the band dissolved. In the end, the Beatles' inner circle was a paradox for George. It was both the greatest blessing of his career and the source of his deepest frustrations. And within that paradox, George Harrison's voice, as quiet as it sometimes seemed, emerged stronger, more spiritual, and ultimately unforgettable. When discussing the Beatles, most fans often focus on the dazzling music, the screaming audiences, and the cultural revolution that the Fab Four spearheaded. But behind the curtain of glory, there was constant tension about the artistic direction of the band. George Harrison, who began as the quiet teenager in the group, eventually grew into a deeply thoughtful, spiritual, and musically adventurous artist. Yet his creative path often collided with others, most notably the person he grew to resent the most. George was not like John Lennon or Paul McCartney, who were naturally competitive and eager to dominate the songwriting credits. Instead, George was patient. He was willing to play rhythm guitar, contribute harmonies, and allow John and Paul to steer the ship. But as time passed, Harrison's own songwriting blossomed. Songs like If I Needed Someone and Taxman proved that he could write, just as brilliantly as his bandmates. The problem? His songs were often treated as afterthoughts. The Beatles' albums would typically feature one or two Harrison tracks, while the rest of the spotlight remained on Lennon and McCartney. This imbalance planted the seeds of resentment. Harrison's frustration only deepened when he began exploring new musical styles that were ahead of his time. While Lennon and McCartney were grounded in traditional rock and pop structures, George gravitated toward Indian classical music. His collaboration with Ravi Shankar and experiments with the sitar created groundbreaking tracks like Within You, Without You. Yet these efforts were not always respected within the band. Lennon reportedly dismissed some of George's spiritual and Eastern-inspired songs as boring, while Paul tried to reshape them into something more commercially palatable. The tension was not just about music, it was also about philosophy. George was on a journey of spiritual discovery. He immersed himself in meditation, Hinduism, and the teachings of gurus like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. For him, music was more than entertainment. It was a path toward enlightenment. But to his bandmates, especially the one he despised most, this mindset came across as pretentious or alienating. George once admitted that he felt mocked for his beliefs, as though his quest for higher meaning was a joke to others in the studio. The clash of visions became especially evident during the Let It Be sessions in 1969. Tensions boiled over as Harrison walked out of the band temporarily, telling them bluntly, "See you around the clubs." He was tired of having his contributions ignored and his artistic voice stifled. This was no minor disagreement. It was the culmination of years of suppressed frustration. The Beatles might have been at the peak of their fame, but for George, the environment had become toxic. It wasn't just John and Paul that he grew disillusioned with. It was particularly the one individual whose dismissive attitude cut the deepest. Whenever George presented a new song, he was often met with skepticism. Instead of encouragement, he received critiques, interruptions, and outright dismissals. He once confided that trying to get his songs heard was like pulling teeth. Imagine having masterpieces like Something or Here Comes the Sun Inside, You, only to have them brushed off by those who were supposed to be your brothers in music. The irony is that when George was finally free from the band, his solo career exploded with brilliance. His triple album, All Things Must Pass, was a towering success, proving that he had been sitting on a treasure chest of songs that the Beatles had overlooked. This success was not only validation, but also a subtle form of revenge. It showed the world that George Harrison's vision, spiritual, melodic, and profound, was not just valid, but extraordinary. In hindsight, George's artistic clashes were not just personal grievances. They symbolized the larger fractures that eventually tore the Beatles apart. The Beatles were no longer four lads chasing fame together. They were four grown men with vastly different identities, ambitions, and worldviews. And for George, the struggle was not only about music, but about respect, recognition, and the freedom to be himself. The clash of artistic visions left scars on his relationships, especially with the person he felt undermined his creativity the most. This wasn't just about disagreements in the studio. It was about George's identity as an artist being constantly invalidated. And when someone feels unheard for too long, resentment turns into bitterness. That bitterness, in George's case, became outright disdain. This was not the story of a man who simply disliked a bandmate. It was the story of a gifted musician who felt robbed of his voice during the most important years of his career. The quiet Beatle was never truly quiet. He was silenced, and that silence eventually erupted into open conflict, shaping the legacy of both George Harrison and the Beatles in ways that fans are still uncovering today. When two towering figures In the music world fall out, the echo of their discord often reverberates louder than their harmony. This was the case with George Harrison and the man he despised. By the time their disagreements reached the point of no return, the aftermath was not just about two individuals, but about the ripple effects it created within the music industry, their shared circles, and even their fans who idolized them both. For George Harrison, a man who had spent most of his young adult life in the blinding spotlight of the Beatles, the concept of peace and personal balance was not just a desire, but a necessity. His spiritual pursuits, his retreat into Indian philosophy, and his yearning for authenticity were his ways of reclaiming a sense of self after years of living under the microscope. Yet the very values he sought to uphold, truth, respect, and integrity, were, in his eyes, violated by the individual he had grown to despise. The breakdown of their relationship was not just a private matter. It became a story told in whispers backstage, hinted at in interviews, and speculated upon in the press. The immediate aftermath of their falling out was a cooling of collaborations, and a noticeable silence where once there might have been camaraderie. George was not one to shout from the rooftops about his grievances. His disdain was quieter, sharper, expressed in carefully chosen words and in the deliberate absence of acknowledgement. He was, after all, not a man who thrived on confrontation. He preferred retreat. But the absence of warmth in his demeanor toward this individual spoke volumes to those who were paying attention. For fans, the realization that their beloved George could harbor such deep disdain was both shocking and oddly humanizing. Many had seen Harrison as the quiet Beatle, the calm, reserved figure who avoided unnecessary drama. To hear that he utterly despised someone forced people to reckon with a side of him they rarely glimpsed. It was proof that even those who seek enlightenment, who meditate and search for higher truths, are not immune to the sting of betrayal, the bitterness of disappointment, and the fire of anger. In many ways, it brought George down from the pedestal of untouchable legend and placed him firmly in the realm of human struggle. The music world, too, felt the impact. Collaborations that might have been legendary never came to pass. Opportunities for reconciliation, moments where art could have bridged divides, were left unrealized. Instead, the silence between them became its own kind of legacy, a reminder of how even the most creative partnerships can dissolve when trust is broken. It added a layer of what if to their story. What if they had managed to reconcile? What music might have been born from forgiveness rather than resentment? And yet, even in the midst of animosity, there were lessons to be learned. George's handling of the situation, though fueled by disdain, still reflected his deeper philosophies. He may have despised the man, but he rarely allowed that hatred to consume him in public. Instead, his choice to distance himself rather than escalate the feud reflected his belief that sometimes the best form of resistance is absence. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that not every battle needs to be fought out loud. Sometimes, silence is the loudest statement of all. As the years passed, the intensity of their rift mellowed in the public eye, but it never fully disappeared. George carried his disdain with him, even as he pursued a life increasingly centered on family, spirituality, and personal projects. And when his own life drew to its close, fans and biographers alike revisited the chapters of conflict in his story, not to diminish his legacy, but to paint a fuller picture of the man behind the music. The aftermath of their rift stands as a testament to the fact that even legends have their breaking points. George Harrison's story is often told through the lens of music, spirituality, and his quest for peace. But it is in moments like this, when peace eluded him, that we see the truest measure of his humanity. He despised, yes, but he also endured. And in enduring, he reminded the world that the pursuit of harmony is not the absence of conflict, but the strength to rise above it, even when the scars remain. If you found this story eye-opening, just wait until you see what we uncovered next. The world of rock and roll is filled with secrets, rivalries, and tragedies that rarely reach the public eye. Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the untold stories of the legends who shaped music history. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It helps us bring you more rare and hidden tales from behind the curtain of fame. Until next time, keep listening, keep questioning, and remember, every legend has a story they don't want told.